All right, Jared. There have been a lot of stories about police officers and people judging their actions. What are some things to consider before folks do that?
You know, every time I see something on social media or on the media or whatnot about a police officer's actions, and oftentimes it's a few second clip of a situation that occurred probably over the course of sometimes hours, maybe 20 minutes or so. First thing I always think is, what is the rest of this story? And I think the public needs to really ask the same question. I'm seeing this small clip, but what led up to this? What happened before? What happened after? What are all of the facts? And let's wait till we know those facts before we pass judgment of what may seem like a very bad situation based on just that 5-second clip.
What is the danger in judging police officers and vilifying them almost?
You know, with some of the more direct repercussions are, we've seen in some cities in the United States where you see officers that are not being proactive about policing certain parts of certain cities because they're afraid of the ramifications of using force against, justifiably using force against a resisting suspect in those areas, so they just kind of leave them alone. And it's the communities in those areas, all the good people in those communities that are suffering by a lack of police presence and a rise in crime. That's
very, very interesting. There is a broader ramifications to this impulsive judging of police actions. That's interesting.
Absolutely, and it's cause and effect, and it's happening a lot. You know, and as law enforcement officials in our community, we as the public expect our law enforcement professionals to get all of the facts and anything they're investigating, get as many facts as they can gather before taking that situation before a court of law, before a judge. I think we owe it to our law enforcement officials to do the same. Before we judge them based on one little thing that we've seen in a video, let's wait for all of the facts to come out and then pass judgment. And maybe the officer was in the wrong, and when they are, I don't defend their actions. But when the officer is in the right and the court of law has shown them to have acted appropriately, but they've already been found guilty in the court of public opinion, it's a travesty, and it ruins people's lives, you know. And so I think we need to be cautious of that.
So police officers are people. They got families to go home
Absolutely.
to.
Absolutely.
You are
I still am a reserve police officer. I work on patrol sometimes. I work in the capacity of a SWAT officer with my department. I worked almost 9 years as a full-time police officer, and so yeah, I've been there. Yeah.
Tell us about some of the stressors, the compounding stressors that a police officer might face.
You know, if you really think about, especially in larger cities and whatnot, or even in small towns, officers are called to deal day to day with crimes that are occurring, and so they deal day in, day out with how do I word this correctly, often the criminal element of society, let's put it that way. People that are conditioned to lie every time they open their mouth to a police officer. They're conditioned to sociopaths in a lot of ways, and so I think a lot of officers deal with that day in and day out, and sometimes unfortunately have a hard time transitioning to dealing with the normal, regular, productive members of society. And so you see that happening. There's a lot of stresses on the job, you know, hypervigilance that occurs when officers are always on edge because of the type of people they deal with day in and day out. And being able to switch that off sometimes and just kind of assimilate back into their normal off-duty life. The stressors that the officers deal with are real, and they can take a toll, and they have an effect on officers' day-to-day lives, and sometimes it's hard to switch that off, and they build a lot of anxiety. So it definitely has a lot of effects. You see a lot of divorces in police officers' families because of that. There's an emotional distancing. I've dealt with it. I've dealt with tragedy. I've dealt with death. I've dealt with all these things, and you have to distance yourself emotionally from what you're dealing with, otherwise you go crazy. You know, it's the things you see and the people that are going through suffering because of things that the different tragedies that happen in their families, and so you start to distance yourself so you don't get emotionally involved with those things and just kind of go crazy. And some officers start to emotionally distance themselves from their friends, from their family, and they healthy ways that officers can actually deal with that so that they don't go through that type of a cycle in their lives. But I think if we understand that, sometimes be courteous to officers. My personal experience is most officers are consummate professionals, but there are some that have a hard time dealing with that stress, and they make it bad for the others by the way they interact with the public, unfortunately. Yeah.
It's hard to be, not for me, but for the general public, it's hard to show empathy to somebody who is an authority figure, somebody who has been, perhaps for better or for worse, painted to be this authority, and so it's hard to correlate that figure with emotions and having to come home to children and family and having to deal with day-to-day life.
Yeah, it is, and because often officers sometimes will come across as being this stone-hearted and cold, and like I said, if you have to deal with the stuff that they deal with day to day, you would be the same. Otherwise, like I said, it would drive you crazy having to see and deal with those types of things. So a lot of times they do distance themselves emotionally. They don't get don't go get involved emotionally with the things that they deal with day in and day out. And unfortunately, sometimes families suffer because of that. Their families, and like I said, I know a lot of good officers who are able to switch that on and off as they come in and out of work and lead healthy off-duty lives also. Yeah.
Tell us about training or lack thereof and how that correlates to, let's talk about Salt Lake City.
Yeah.
There hasn't been a homicide by police since 2015.
Yeah.
What do you think contributed to that?
There's a lot of things you could play with those statistics in different ways, and I'm going to play with them in a positive way. I come from that department. I was part of the training unit there, and I know that they have good training programs there. Before I was in the training unit, they were always very progressive. I didn't realize how good they were until I started traveling the country and traveling the world training police officers, and I realized what a great program that they have. And they have a very active community-oriented policing programs, actively finding ways to get the police involved. I was involved with some of those programs when I was a police officer there, working on a mountain bike patrol, where it's when you're driving around in a car, you're kind of detached from the community. When you're in the central business district of a city and you're on a bike, you can stop and talk to business owners, talk to people on the street, and get more intimately involved with the community. But also the use of force. Salt Lake City is one of the first departments in the country to actively use simunition, marking cartridges and training, and start bringing some realistic scenario-based training, stress inoculation, and as a result, you've seen people perform better under stress. Maybe that doesn't mean that they necessarily go quicker to a lethal force situation. Maybe they're able to make a quicker decision against using lethal force, or maybe they've been trained better in the use of less lethal force, so they are more confident and competent in their ability to make that work, and less likely to go higher in the force continuum than they would be otherwise.
Jared, thank you for the insight. Wrapping this up, what can the average citizen do for themselves when they find themselves in a position where they have to engage with a police officer?
Police officers appreciate courtesy and a lot of times reciprocate, and so whether or not I'm getting a ticket, I would always just be the police officers are doing their job to the best of their ability. If I am getting a ticket, probably means I did something wrong, and so I'm not going to I think if we're courteous, if you're courteous with the police, you're more likely to get a warning. And if you don't get a warning, then courtesy goes a long way. It makes making police officers feel that they're appreciated in the community. In general, despite what's happening in this country with some of the negativity towards law enforcement, I feel that we are still in a better place. I've traveled to other countries and I see some of the more negativity towards law enforcement in other countries. I think we're not that bad, and I think we've got room to improve. But just courtesy goes a long way, and there's a lot of reciprocation.
Jared, thank you very much for this invaluable insight. We really appreciate it.
No problem. My pleasure.